Hi, welcome to this video. In this video, I'm not going to be commenting on a game that I'm playing live, or one of my own games at all for that matter. But instead, I'd like to highlight a game played in a couple months ago, October 28th, 2016 to be exact, in the Corsica Masters between Viswanathan Anand, playing white, and Timur Radjabov, playing black. I think this game has a couple of interesting features. The opening is somewhat interesting, but stay tuned to the end because the end game I think is particularly instructive. So Vichy opens with e4, Radjabov responds with e5. We get a standard Ruy Lopez, and Radjabov plays his standard response, f5, the Jaenisch or Schliemann gambit, which can be a somewhat risky opening for black, but certainly has its merits. White here has a number of options. Vichy chose a somewhat safe choice with d3. There's a trade on e4, and both sides develop. Here white trades on c6 and wins the e5 pawn. After all, this is a gambit from black, so it makes sense that he'd go down a pawn, at least temporarily. It's risky for white to try and keep the pawn here. Black develops. White retreats the knight, leaving his own pawn hanging, but attacking the bishop, and so the net effect of this is that black regains the pawn at the cost of the bishop pair. And this is a more or less equal position, but there's still a lot to be played. Both sides continue to develop. Here white plays knight d2, playing a move like c4, trying to gain space would allow black to play d5 and strike back in the center, so white plays knight d2. The other reason for this move is that here if black tries to play d5, white can play knight b3. And the goal of white's play in this position would be to try and dominate the c5 square. You can imagine a dream endgame scenario where white gets a knight on c5, only opposed by the bishop on c8, which would mean the knight has a permanent home on that great outpost. So instead, after knight d2, black plays d6, stopping white from owning the c4 square, and actually black is planning on maybe playing c5 themselves and controlling some dark squares. So white plays b4. So the c5 square is quite contested in the last few moves. So we can look at this position. White actually with b4 is not only preventing c5, but also gaining space on the queen side. Meanwhile, black's pieces are positioned quite well for a kingside initiative, and over the next few moves, both players develop along these lines. Right? Black plays queen f6, a4, knight f4, c4, queen g6. This is threatening mate on g2. Right? White easily parries this threat by just trading the knight. And Anand here plays rook a3. This is a nice move. This not only could help white develop more of an initiative on the queen side, this also allows the rook to perform a defensive task by sliding over along the third rank. Black continues to try and drum up activity on the king side with bishop g4, f3, bishop h3 threatens mate on g2 again, rook f2 defends, rook e8 grabs the open file. But it's also interesting, black could have tried to centralize their pieces after bishop h3 has done its job by misplacing the rook, so might play back to e6. White would have to defend the c-pawn, and here black might consider playing a5. If white trades on a5, now the rook, instead of being developed on the open e-file, is developed along the open fifth rank and can slide over to the king side this way. Instead, black played rook e8, which is perfectly reasonable. You're taking the open file. White plays rook e2, the other rook drops back to f8, knight f1, a6. So here we can see that white's defended on the king side well. There's no mate coming right away, or yet, for black. So here black has turned their attention to the queen side and played a6 as a defensive move to stop some of white's play there. It also would have been possible for black, again, to try and play a more centralized strategy by trading rooks, taking the open file, and bringing the bishop back and targeting c4. This, again, should be a somewhat equal position. It was just a different way black could have gone. Instead, they chose to counter white's queenside activity with a6. White played b5. There were a couple trades on b5. And here, black is going after the weak b5 pawn with a move like rook e5. And the b5 pawn is currently hanging. White chooses not to defend it, but rather plays knight g3. This unpins the g2 pawn, and so now the bishop on h3 is in danger. It wasn't in danger in some of the other lines when it dropped back to e6, but it is in danger now. Black does have enough time to take on b5, right? We can't take on h3 yet because of the threat of rook b1, and the queen is pinned to the king, and the queen will be lost. So instead of taking on h3, Anand played rook c3. But in fact, there was an even better move. Rook b3 attacks not only the rook on b5, but also eliminates the rook b1 threat, and so now the bishop on h3 is also hanging. It's in essence a double attack. Black could defend against this with rook f to b8, supporting the b5 rook, and if there's a trade on b5, then the rook b1 idea is still active. Just to show you what would have happened if black traded on b3, white would take back with check, and then after a whole bunch of trades, at the end of that line, again just to show for emphasis, that bishop that was on h3 is lost. So instead, if we go back to after rook takes b5, Anand did not play the most testing move, which was rook b3, but instead played rook c3, but it was also logical. He's targeting the c7 pawn. Black still has some of the same problems in the position. So they finally try and solve one of these problems by dropping the bishop back to f5. White has enough time to take on c7 here because on rook b1, which was played, white has rook c1. There was a trade on c1, and Radjabov decided to improve the queen, although Her Majesty is still tied to the defense of f5, so it might have been better to play a move like bishop to d3, activating the bishop, and then only later moving the queen somewhere else. But instead, queen f6 was played, after which we had queen c4 check, the king moved over, rook d2, targeting the d6 pawn. Black plays bishop g6. This secures the bishop. This allows the queen to focus her attention elsewhere instead of doing guard duty. And it's useful because white's next move actually asks the black queen to focus her attention to the d4 square, which she does. There's a trade on d4. And we reach this endgame, which should be drawn, according to the computer, although white is the one with the easier task because white has a clear target, the d6 pawn. And it's really instructive, I think, to see how Anand applies pressure to black's position. He gains space on the king side, he improves his rook and his knight, and he finally improves his king. And he's able to do all of this due to the fact that black has to worry constantly about defending the d-pawn. So he starts with gaining space with g4, and both sides now try and improve their pieces. So we have bishop f7 from black, king f2, whole bunch of shuffling. Black plays g6 to deny white's knight the outpost on f5. White again is looking for ways to improve their knight. So black ends up moving his pawn. It was under some pressure on d6. Now at least on d5 it can be defended by the bishop. A little bit more of a stable square. White continues to gain space on the king side. We have again several more moves. And if you take a look at this position compared to the one we had about 10 moves ago, white has made a lot of progress. Their rook is behind the passed pawn. The rook's also cutting off the black king. Black king can't go backwards onto the 8th rank. The white knight is on a very nice square compared to the black bishop, which is just doing guard duty of a very defensive position. And most importantly, white has more space, and white's king is in a much more active position than black. We'll see that ends up playing a big role later in the game. Black here has to defend patiently, and so a lot of their next few moves are just shuffling the rook back and forth. White again gains more space on the king side. We have more shuffling, a lot of shuffling, quite a long game, so I'll try and skip through the shuffling. I'll shuffle through the shuffling a little bit. This last move from black, though, rook a3 check, actually ends up driving the white king to a good square. And in fact, you can keep checking it, it's going to keep running up the board. So now we reach this point where, again, white's pieces are better placed, and white's position actually has a latent threat. So if black continues to try and mark time with a move like rook b7, black would actually be punished for this, or could be punished. White can trade everything on f7, win the d5 pawn, and be in a position to invade black's king side and actually win the g pawn. So black here can't actually stop the white king from invading. One line just to illustrate this, black can try and prevent the king from coming in with king e7, but with king e5, white gets the opposition, and you might have moves like king f7, king d6, king f8, king e6, king g7, king g7, king e7, and you can see here that black is going to get pushed back into the corner, the g pawn is going to fall, and with 2 extra pawns it would be a very easy win for white. So that's white's threat in this position, to win the d5 pawn under those circumstances. So Radjabov didn't play rook b7. What he played was also not sufficient for defense. The actual best move in this position, which would probably keep the game a draw, would be to play d4. So again, this actually, you're going to lose that d pawn one way or another. You might as well lose it under the best circumstances possible. Here, if white tries the same idea as before, taking on everything on f7, and then tries to win the d pawn, here the white king is slightly less active, and it gives chance for black to put their king on a more active square, and this actually allows black to prevent white from invading. So even though white is up a pawn, there's actually no route for them to get in and win that g pawn. So this should be a draw with careful play from black. Instead, what Radjabov did after rook f6 was play bishop e8 and look for piece activity to compensate for the pawn deficit that he's about to experience after king d5. So now black is able to check the king a bit, check them all over the place. And again, as long as black can hold the g pawn, they should have some chances to draw. White plays f4, securing some of their position. Again, black is going to mark time with the rook while the white king returns to a more active post. And we reach this position in which it's probably best here for black to continue to mark time with the rook and move back, let's say, to a7. Instead, Radjabov spotted an active defense, which actually ends up losing. So sometimes being too active is not a good thing. Radjabov played rook d5 with the idea of going after the f4 pawn. Here, white plays rook b7, and after rook takes f4, white's position, white actually played a move here, and black resigned on the next move. So material is equal. Black's finally accomplished this dream of taking off that extra pawn, but the problem here is that white's pieces are much better placed. That bishop is pinned, it's defensive. The rook on the 7th looks great. The knight on e5 looks great. But actually the best piece that white has here is the king on c6. The king is much better placed than the black king. And this is kind of highlighted by white's next move, which is to trade on f7. And here, black actually resigned, because they realize that they're going to end up in a lost king and pawn endgame. One possible way that this game could have continued would be, of course, trading everything on f7, and then white playing king d7. Black would have really nowhere else to go but to try and stay as close as they can to the g-pawn. White continues to maintain the opposition, which means black's king is forced back. And here, black must make a move. Actually, there's only one legal move. It's king h8, which abandons the g-pawn and also abandons all hopes of drawing this game. So I hope you enjoyed this game. I thought it was a somewhat interesting opening and middle game. A nice way to see that white defended while maintaining some initiative on the queen side, and especially instructive to see how they were able to apply pressure and win in the endgame. Alright, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll have more videos like this one up in the future. Thanks. Bye.